Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. In his treatise on the anger of God, there are two ancient philosophical schools that will come in for considerable analysis and criticism by Lactantius. One of them is the Epicureans, who he treats first, and then he'll discuss the Stoics. And he seems to think that the Stoics are less wrong than the Epicureans, but they still manage to get some things incorrect, and so they also will have a mistaken viewpoint on whether or not it makes sense to attribute anger to God. And so he's going to say they're only partly wrong. Why? Well, because they, as he says, entertain better sentiments, who say there is kindness in God, but not anger. And then he says, a very pleasing and popular speech that God is not subject to such littleness of mind as to imagine he is injured by anyone, since it is impossible for him to be injured. And in some respect, Lactantius is also targeting fellow Christian thinkers who would say, oh, no, God is just loving and good and beneficent. God never gets angry. That stuff talked about in the writings, that's just anthropomorphizing. Don't worry about that sort of thing. Lactantius is saying, no, God actually does get angry and exhibit kindness. And in fact, in chapter 6, he's going to say, God is angry precisely because of his kindness. But how do we get there? Well, so the Stoics think that anger is, as he says, a commotion, a commotio, right? And perturbatio, a stirring up of the mind, and that this would be inconsistent with God, right? It would be unbecoming of the divine, like he says. When it falls on the mind of any person, as a violent tempest, it excites such waves that it changes the condition of the mind. And then we get a very interesting description. This is kind of a commonplace in ancient philosophical discussions of anger. We see this, for example, in Seneca's on anger and Plutarch's, on controlling anger. So, this isn't really becoming of the highest being in the universe. And he's going to make an a fortiori argument here that the Stoics would advance, namely that if anger is unbecoming to a human being, provided they be of wisdom and authority, how much so is so foul a change unbecoming to God? And if a human being, when they have authority and power, inflicts widespread injury through anger, sheds blood, overthrows cities, destroys communities, reduces provinces to desolation, how much more is it to be believed that God, since he has power over the whole human race and the universe itself, would have been about to destroy all things if he was angry? So the idea is God doesn't get angry. I mean, look, the world exists. Human beings, when they're angry, they're very destructive. God's not going to do that sort of thing. And Lactantius is going to say, okay, fair enough, but you Stoics, you're missing out on something. You're stressing the good side. He says, they think so great and pernicious and evil ought to be absent from God, and if anger and excitement are absent from him, well, then what remains? Being calm, propitious, beneficent, the preserver. Isn't that nice, right? This is what the divine nature involves. And then he says, well, no, that's not quite capturing what God is. Why? Because if God is not angry with the impious and the unrighteous, it's clear he does not love the pious and the righteous. Therefore, the error of those is more consistent who take away anger and kindness. In opposite matters, it's necessary to be moved to both sides or to neither. He goes on, he who loves the good also hates the wicked. That's part of what it means to love in the first place. If you love this, you hate the opposite. The loving of the good arises from the hatred of the wicked, and the hatred of the wicked has its rise from the love of the good. There's no one who loves life without hatred of death, he says, or who is desirous of light, but he who avoids darkness. These are so connected by nature, the one cannot exist without the other. So he's saying here that you're not seeing the connection between love and hate, and therefore between kindness and anger. You can't have the two of these in a rational, wise being without having the other one, and this is where you Stoics are going wrong. And he's got a very interesting analogy here, which he'll use at several points about the owner or master of a household. And he says, in this case, if a master has in his household a good and a bad servant, it's evident he doesn't hate them both or confer upon both benefits and honors. If he does this, he's unjust and foolish. Right? So, you Stoics, you want to say that God would have the virtues of wisdom and justice, but if you construe God as being like this, master of a household or owner of a business, pick whatever you want, who doesn't actually take cognizance of whether people are doing the right thing or the wrong thing, and thereby be moved by emotions toward, good ones towards the one person, the good person, and bad ones or, hostile ones towards the bad person, well, then your God isn't much of a God. He's not just, he's not wise. So you Stoics, you've screwed up here. He also brings up another point where he's going to say the Stoics partly right, partly wrong. And this is in chapter 13, where he's talking about providence. Now, providence is this notion that there is a sort of plan, a structure, a ruling. He uses the word administration, administratio, or governing, gubernatio, quite often in this treatise. And so, he thinks that God is a hands-on kind of God. And he thinks that the Stoics, are right in saying that God is like that as well. And that the world was actually made for us, on our account, for human beings, right? And this is indeed a traditional Stoic teaching that irrational nature exists for the sake of rational nature, which includes us and also God and any other rational beings, right? So he thinks the Stoics are right about that, but then he brings up a challenge that the academics have, a very understandable challenge. Hey, if that's the case, then why is this universe filled with so many things that are opposed to us and going beyond being opposed, that are hostile to us and going beyond being hostile, that actually hurt us, that are damaging to us? I mean, think about it. There's so many ways that you can get injured or killed in this world, including by other human beings, but all the different creatures, there are diseases, various other things, natural disasters that just, happen to us, like an earthquake or volcano, or, if we're thinking about shows from the 1970s, quicksand, which doesn't seem to be as prevalent as those shows made it out to be. But, the academics are saying, hey, why isn't the universe set up in such a way that we don't run into all these evils? And he says that the Stoic response to this is actually quite foolish. What is the Stoic response? Well, you just haven't seen the big picture yet. All of these things are actually useful or helpful to us human beings in one way or another. They're not really bads. They're not really evils. And he's got, kind of a throwaway line here, which is quite funny. He brings up animals, like the viper when burnt and reduced to ashes is a remedy for the bite of the same beast. And we might say the same thing about milking snakes' venom to make anti-venom, right? Or toxins or whatever it happens to be. And then he says, wouldn't it have been a lot simpler just not to make a snake in the first place? Or don't give them venom, right? How much better had it been that it should not exist at all than that a remedy should be required against it drawn from itself? He doesn't, interestingly, say, you Stoics, you don't actually know whether any of these things are good for us or not. He just says, let's assume they are. Doesn't it seem like a very roundabout way for God to do things? So that's kind of an interesting argument. And then the third criticism, is really that the Stoics made a fundamental error in their approach to the emotions. And the error consists in this: not seeing that there is good and bad or just and unjust anger. And he discusses this in chapter 17, where he's going to tell us that to be angry is actually on the part of reason, if it's just anger, right? The faults are removed, licentiousness is curbed. This is plainly in accordance with justice and wisdom. So it makes sense for human beings sometimes to get angry and for God to get angry as well. But the Stoics, failing to make the distinction between just and unjust anger, they thought that it was all unjust or bad. And he says, because they didn't find a remedy for the matter, medelam re, right? They wanted to excise anger entirely. And if you look at, for example, Seneca's work on anger, I think this kind of exemplifies it. He tries to close off any possibility of anger being good or helpful or useful or necessary in any way. And then he says, the philosophers were ignorant of what's translated here as the nature of anger, but we could say the account of anger. Quae ratio esset ire. What anger, would be, what its reason, what its structure, what the account of it would be. And because the philosophers were ignorant of this, their definitions aren't very good. Well, they're good for a certain kind of anger, right? As he goes on and he says, this is the unjust anger concerning which we spoke before, which is contained even in dumb animals, to be restrained in human beings, lest they rush to some very great evil through rage. So those definitions are okay for unjust, wrong, vicious anger, right? And what are these definitions? He says, Seneca tells us in his book on anger, anger is the desire of avenging an injury or the desire of punishing the person by whom you think you've been unfairly injured, an incitement of the mind to injure him who has either committed an injury or has wished to do so. He also brings up Aristotle, but we're not looking at the criticism here, so we don't have to worry about that, right? And he goes on to say, well, there is the possibility of just anger. God exhibits just anger, as do some human beings, and so they should have given this definition. Anger is an emotion of the mind arousing itself for the restraining of faults. If anger is understood in that way, well, then anger is actually something not only good, but something just, something needed, something required. And so God could, in fact, feel and should feel, and does feel, according to Lactantius, that kind of anger. The Stoics just didn't see that, and that's why they remove anger from God. So we've got some interesting criticisms of the Stoic approach to anger, as well as to the world and providence made by Lactantius here in his treatise on the anger of God. Are they entirely on point? Could the Stoics possibly respond to them? Maybe, but these are what we find here in the text.